But I'm going to throw so much information at you in history about this whole Ukraine and Russia conflict that you probably haven't heard anything like this anywhere else. Don't forget to subscribe, like the video, share the video. These videos have been getting censored, especially when you're not feeding into that general mainstream media narrative. So before I start, I do want to say we all need to have an open mind. I'm extremely patriotic. I love my country. I'll die for this country. But I am well aware that the United States does overstep sometimes. And when it comes to war, it's not always black and white. In fact, it's probably never black and white. There's two sides. And that's kind of what I want to paint a picture of today. Furthermore, I want to disclose that all the information I go over is from government policy and documents, official government documents, actual video evidence, and I have one essay from Brookings that is a very good information piece, and I'll link all of this stuff in the description so you can go and verify everything I'm saying as it is. So we need to go back to Ronald Reagan, Mikhail Gorbachev. They start forming a very respective relationship with each other, something that has not yet occurred between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. They made leaps and bounds, and even though Gorbachev was a communist, he still opened up the door for a more progressive Russia, or Soviet Union for that matter. When it came time to knock down the Berlin Wall and reunify Germany, James Baker, a U.S. official, and Western German leadership promised Gorbachev that NATO would not continue to expand past Germany. They just wanted the reunification, and that was it. He didn't need to worry about it. In 1991, Boris Yeltsin is elected as the president of Russia. Now, we need to understand when the Soviet Union existed, no different than like the United States, and you had the federal government and you had the states. The Soviet Union collapsed due to Boris Yeltsin getting together with leadership in Ukraine and Belarus in a secret meeting, signing an agreement that ultimately dissolved the Warsaw Pact. Gorbachev, being the leader of the Soviet Union, was immediately undermined and had no more power. This was a successful coup attempt by Yeltsin. Yeltsin was favored by the United States. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had a few big things take place. The first is you now had these newly formed independent countries that just went from being a communist society to a free market society literally overnight. The economies of these countries were terrible. Inflation was skyrocketing. They had nothing. You had elderly people who had social welfare benefits that lost everything. Like imagine losing Social Security when you're already in retirement and can't work anymore. That's what went on in these former Soviet states. The United States brings in three policies that really sway how this thing went. The first and most important one is the Freedom Support Act of 1992. It's on congress.gov. Again, I'll post a link. This is the summary of it. What the Freedom Support Act did was it was going to offer economic and humanitarian aid to these former Soviet states, as long as they abided by the rules and restrictions that this bill placed on them. The goal of the bill was to provide immediate humanitarian needs, establishing a democratic and free society, creating private enterprise and free market system based on the principle of private ownership of property, and promoting trade and investment. It also prohibited Russia if it failed to make progress on the removal of troops from Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and has failed to undertake good faith efforts to end other military practices that violate the sovereignty of the Baltic states. The next provision of this, and this opened the door for all of the corruption you hear about with the whole Hunter Biden deal and these American businesses going over to Ukraine and taking advantage of a new emerging unregulated marketplace. It wasn't just Ukraine, it was all around the world, but this bill opened the door for it to happen in that region. Title III, Business and Commercial Development. It encourages the president to establish the American business centers in the independent states where the president determines that such centers can be cost-effective in promoting the objectives of Title II and U.S. economic interests and in establishing commercial partnerships between the United States and the independent states. The entire goal of this bill was to expand U.S. business interests in these new regions that they never had control before. It also made funds available from the Overseas Private Investment Corporation Program in these independent states. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation Program, I've talked about this on my show. That's the OPIC. The OPIC is the main driver of why politicians can get rich and make money in these endeavors, and no one knows about it. Now, Title V of this agreement is the Non-Proliferation and Disarmament Programs and Activities. It permits non-proliferation assistance to be obligated for an independent state only if the president has certified to the Congress that such state is committed to 1. Making a substantial investment of its resources for dismantling or destroying weapons of mass destruction if obligated to do so under an agreement. Foregoing any military modernization program that exceeds legitimate defense requirements and foregoing the replacement of destroyed weapons of mass destruction. 3. Foregoing any use in nuclear weapons of components or destroyed nuclear weapons and facilitating U.S. verification of weapons destruction carried out under this act or the Soviet Nuclear Threat Reduction Act of 1991. So they had to get rid of their weapons programs. And the reason, you may be thinking, well, only Russia has them. No. Actually, Ukraine, I believe, became the second or third largest nuclear power as soon as the USSR collapsed. They had like 1,800 nuclear weapons. They also had the chemical and biological labs. So when all this happens, the USSR is now gone. You have independent states. But Russia had citizens that were actually stationed and living in these states. There were 700,000 Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Crimea was almost entirely Russian. Crimea was home to the Black Fleet in Sevastopol, still is. So you had millions of Russian citizens that were immediately, illegally and unlawfully in these other states by the signing of a pen. Ukraine wanted all of the military servicemen and women that were Russian to pledge allegiance to Ukraine. And they also wanted ownership of all the weapons that were left in Ukraine. This didn't go down well with the Russians. Ukraine also relied entirely on Russian energy at this time. So I'm not going to go too in depth, but I will say that disputes between the two countries, territorial disputes and economic disputes, ended up with Russia using its own energy as leverage against Ukraine and threatening to completely cut it off. This goes on through the 90s. Ukraine and Russia are experiencing inflation at like 50 to 100% per month. Think about that. Right now we're experiencing 7.9% inflation. They were experiencing 50 to 100% per month. It was not a good time. We also had a Balkan conflict. That is another complicated dispute that I'm not going to go in depth in, but that's your Yugoslavia, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, that whole region. Russia gets involved.